It's always less painful to prepare and have a maintenance program in place in advance of an outbreak than it is to try to scramble and deal with an outbreak once it's occurred. We're fortunate in many ways to have a very robust public and animal health apparatus that manages most of that for us and protects us from the impacts of that the vast majority of the time. Hi, welcome back to the BioSAFE Engineering Podcast. I'm Dan Nelsen. Today we're going to chat a little bit about updates on the New World screwworm outbreak in the US. First, as a quick reminder, New World screwworm isn't necessarily a traditional disease in that it's not a bacteria or a virus. It's actually a parasitic fly who lays its eggs in the skin of affected animals. And as those eggs hatch and grow, they actually start eating the animal. So it's a parasitic disease, which we're primarily concerned about in cattle, but can also affect pets and in some rare circumstances, humans. Since we last spoke, New World screwworm has continued to spread mostly in Texas. The U.S. federal state response has been fairly robust. The USDA has partnered with local agencies in Texas. They've dramatically stepped up monitoring. They've dramatically stepped up movement controls of affected or potentially affected animals, rolling out increased monitoring, and they've dramatically ramped up sterile fly production. So as a reminder, one of the main interventions we have targeting preventing the spread of New World screwworm is producing sterile flies, which are then reduced in very large quantities, millions of flies per week, that mate with the natural-born flies and aren't able to reproduce. And so that's able to create a population bottleneck and hopefully slow and eventually stop the spread of New World screwworm. So the biggest benefit of early detection is that you're not scrambling to play catch up. One of the issues when a disease or outbreak spreads beyond a contained status is that you're very much trying to detect where it's present, where it might move to next, and trying to allocate resources and personnel to be able to manage that regardless of where it is. With an effective monitoring program, you're ideally able to prevent an outbreak getting a foothold in the first place. And so you have more of a steady state outlay of resources. You're not having to pull in extra resources, extra personnel to try to surge to combat the outbreak. You're better able just to work at a steady state pace with more consistent workforce and resource outlay to kind of manage that outbreak. And then obviously the practical implications of that is you have much less disruption, both on the agricultural side. So if we think about the cattle ranchers and processors who are involved in the cattle life cycle in the US, this has all been very disruptive for them. They have to do additional reporting. They have to manage the movements of their herds. It's just a very cumbersome and costly process for them. And it's much easier if we don't get to the stage where we have to impose those restrictions on them. Similarly, if that continues or grows in scope or scale, we might start seeing impacts on consumers. So ideally, a strong prevention and monitoring program prevents any of those pieces from having to come into play. Mandatory measures are going to vary a great deal by jurisdiction and what the organism or disease concerned is. BioSAFE has always been an advocate for having preventative or surge measures in place or ready to go in advance of an outbreak. So as an example, if you have a herd of cattle that needs to be destroyed because they're contaminated either with New World screwworm or with other infectious or potentially infectious diseases, having equipment and trained personnel ready to go that you can move out to the affected area to immediately treat and destroy any infectious material gives you that much stronger of an ability to manage any pre-outbreaks such that they don't become full-fledged outbreaks requiring emergency responses. So BioSafe's actually partnered with a number of state and federal organizations in previous outbreaks, including chronic wasting in Wisconsin, to do exactly that. And so that's really the model that we've seen be the most effective in the past. Have this capacity, have the personnel trained and ready to go, have a consortium of states and affected stakeholders who all have buy-in and are all working together to flag up any areas where this equipment may need to be deployed to, and work with stakeholders to prevent outbreaks from being able to set foot. So it's really just a matter of cost, impact, and time. The later things go before they're caught or addressed meaningfully. The longer an outbreak has to spread, to really kind of get settled into a region or into a vector, the harder and more costly it is to eliminate afterwards. And in some cases, that may not even be possible. So you can see very pronounced impacts to agriculture, to economy, at a certain point, even to consumer lifestyle habits from unmanaged outbreaks. So the more robust a management solution you're able to employ in advance, the more you're able to mitigate any damage or concern from that outbreak. The most careful planning is going to be for prion diseases. So that's going to be like chronic wasting disease, bovine spongiform encephalopathy, or hoof and mouth disease, Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease in humans. Prion diseases are misfolded proteins that, when they come into contact with regularly folded proteins, cause them to misfold as well. So it causes a chain reaction of sorts. And where you generally see this occur is in the brain tissue of affected animals. Now, the trouble with protein-based diseases is traditional destruction techniques don't destroy proteins. So even if you've nominally burned an affected carcass, if scavenger animals come in and pick through those bones, pick through that residual, you may still have non-denatured proteins that are available to be taken up and either spread through the host organism or elsewhere in the environment. So with prion diseases, there's a very specific, much narrower set of valid treatment technologies, of which one is tissue digestion. So using alkaline hydrolysis to fully break down all proteins, that prevents prion disease from being able to spread. As we look at other disease types, the traditional treatment method is typically dig and bury. So you dig a large, ideally lined, not always trench. You bury the affected animals in that trench, and then you cover it with dirt. There are a number of issues depending on how that plan is executed. The first is as animals decompose, so they give off gases. That can lead to situations where the very trench then explodes or opens up, then exposing those affected animals to scavenger or carrion animals, which can then move the disease or spread it to a wider geography. To manage those instances, if it's not a prion disease, we might look at something like our STI medical waste treatment system, which uses heat to kill any pathogens, so typically bacteria, viruses, fungal spores that may be present in that waste material. So then when it's disposed of or spread out over land, there's no infectious organisms for scavengers or carrion animals to pick up and move with them. And this gets to one of the pieces with kind of preparation and state and local shareholder buy-in, right? Because for different types of outbreaks, you may need different ready responses ready to go, and having a system that is tailored to chronic wasting disease or prion disease specifically is fantastic and ready to go for those diseases. But you may need another system in place for COVID waste, for other waste types that's applicable and able to deploy to treat that outbreak. Let's take a minute and just think about what the logistics of on-site treatment versus off-site treatment look like for managing a disease outbreak. If you have, say, a cattle disease and you're going to where the affected animal is, you take that animal carcass, you bring it via truck or other method over the roads, call it 100 miles, 150 miles to a treatment site, you create the opportunity for risk. You create the opportunity for accidents. If there's a car accident, the truck hits another car, goes over. If the payload wasn't properly secured, if it starts hailing particularly heavily and knocks something loose from the back of the truck, those are all opportunities for the disease to spread. And now you have to look at the entire route that the affected animal was taken on as potentially affected areas and where it could have spread from there. Obviously, as the distances grow greater, the associated potential risk grows greater. Now, compare that with a system or a solution that you can bring to the affected site. So if we change gears and think about chicken flu for a second, if you're able to bring a solution to the chicken coop where chicken flu was detected, you're able to safely destroy all of those animals in place. And you're not looking at bringing a coop's worth of chickens over the road to another site, unloading it and treating it there. And that requires a lot of work to make sure that there's no cross-transference along that process. So with a model where you can bring the treatment solution on site, manage the affected animals in place, and minimize any potential for spread along the route the truck would take to a treatment center, the more likely you are to be able to quickly and efficaciously mitigate your disease outbreak. It's always less painful to prepare and have a maintenance program in place in advance of an outbreak than it is to try to scramble and deal with an outbreak once it's occurred. We're fortunate in many ways to have a very robust public and animal health apparatus that manages most of that for us and protects us from the impacts of that the vast majority of the time. On the other hand, one risk with that is that it can make the impact of outbreaks seem further away or less severe because fewer of us have to interact with them regularly. That can make the need or necessity for these prevention or mitigation programs then seem less important or less immediately relevant. So I think it's important when something like this happens, and fortunately it's still fairly minor, fairly well contained, that we all take it as a reminder of the importance of prevention mitigation programs.